So firstly, I think in terms of the British context and the wider topic, I think we need a theoretical and a rhetorical rethinking about the way we talk about nationalism and internationalism, and sort of the concept of Britain, the concept of, you know, the UK and identities, organizational and political structures. I feel like often people talk about the concept of Britain and the nation state as if it's just a given, and there doesn't seem to be much deconstructing of the idea and a reimagining of an alternative way that individuals can identify. And I think that's a barrier to developing socialist internationalist organization where the base assumption is that we're operating within these national units. I do think there needs to be a bit more of an imagination about alternatives. The second issue, I think, is that there's this sort of knee-jerk reaction when it comes to imperialism, being anti-imperialist, where it's almost as if the way to be anti-imperialist is just to support nationalist self-determination. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with nationalist self-determination, and obviously movements to break off from imperial powers, like the United Kingdom might be seen as imperial power. I often feel that when the discourse is happening, it's just a dichotomy between the imperialist state or the nationalist state. And I feel like rhetorically and linguistically, we aren't talking about an alternative structure to those two extremes. Theorizing that and speaking about that is a way to begin moving towards a practical reality. And I know it sounds quite off the wall and quite hard to imagine, but I do think it's something we need to talk about more. I want to think about how we can move beyond simply calling for solidarity with nationalist movements towards building something that is a socialist internationalist movement, beyond liberal internationalist organisation. And I do want to talk a bit about the Brexit debate in Britain. So I think the Brexit debate in Britain is an expression of that nationalism. I think a lot of the audience here will probably be agreed on that point. But the debate on the British left has been dominated by the EU is bad, the EU is imperialist, the white northern working class has been ignored, and we need to go back, the Labour Party needs to go back and represent those groups. So again, this whole anti-imperialist nationalist dichotomy has dominated the rhetoric. And of course there have been a small minority on the left, such as people in Another Europe is Possible, Socialist Resistance, etc., have been trying to shift that narrative. But in the main, Corbyn has, whilst he was in power, he didn't really use his platform to shift that narrative to something that produced an alternative internationalism. He sort of tried to sidestep the issue of Brexit, and I think that was quite unhelpful. Similarly, then McCluskey and Unite's position did the same thing, and it sort of played into the patriotism narrative, the good British white northern working class narrative, the abandoned Red Wall. All of that rhetoric has been really unhelpful, and elements of the liberal Labour movement have also promoted that rhetoric too. So this like alternative signpost, this sort of alternative pole in terms of the discourse hasn't really been established, and I think that would be something that we need to work towards establishing more prominently. After Corbyn left, this Rebecca Long-Bailey's leadership campaign just continued that. I don't know if anyone saw the interview she did with her typical Manchester constituents, an elderly white couple complaining about immigrants in the NHS. She didn't really challenge the idea. She sort of tried to sidestep it again. And even Momentum, they didn't campaign against xenophobia very hard. They released one video towards the end of the electoral campaign that tried to address this argument that migrants lower wages and migrants are the problem, but they didn't campaign hard. So we're left with this situation where, because these arguments weren't challenged, because they were sort of sidestepped and awkwardly pushed to the side or actively surreptitiously sort of nudged along, we now have the situation where vast swathes of people have been taken in by the right-wing xenophobic rhetoric, and Labour lost huge numbers of seats. I don't want to over-exaggerate that loss. There are obviously large elements of the population in Northern and Red Wall areas who are internationalist and pro-migrant, but evidently there's a substantial element of the population that isn't. And I'm sure everyone is on the same page with me on this, so I don't want to labour that point too much. But the total failure to link the issue of Brexit and migration, and the total failure to use the platform of the Labour leadership to battle the right-wing arguments and engage with them head-on, left the left in a completely lost and disoriented situation where the right has taken over the political battleground and the liberal centrists are also giving way. Keir Starmer's not budging. And interestingly, during Rebecca Long-Bailey's campaign, her sort of capitulation to that argument allowed Keir Starmer to outflank her during his leadership campaign, because he was releasing all these videos of multicultural London, young people, lots of racially diverse videos, didn't really touch on the issue of migration, but sent out that messaging that he was a more globalist politician. And that was entirely cynical on Keir Starmer's part, because he's now been very reticent on the issue. But that was a cynical way of manipulating the Labour membership to support his campaign, and many Corbyn supporters voted for him. And it's interesting that even the Corbyn left and Rebecca Long-Bailey weren't able to grasp that a large number of the Labour membership that joined in 2015 because of Corbyn have this naturally internationalist, globalist outlook, and they didn't play to that and instead played to the whole Brexit narrative because they wanted to blame the Liberal Remainers for the 2019 defeat. That cost them the leadership election too. Moving on from Britain and the Labour Party, I want to talk a bit more about the global situation. I worked with Neil Faulkner, Samir Dati and Phil Hurst on a book, Creeping Fascism. And in that book, there's a lot of research documenting country by country in Europe, India, Turkey, the USA, developments politically, socially, culturally that we believe is demonstrating a process of creeping fascism, the rise of the far right, taking positions of power politically, taking positions of power within the state, taking power in the media, winning over the population. And this is happening in a slow and surreptitious way, and we think that the places that it's going are not looking good and frankly very dangerous. And we were working on this last year, and now if you look at the developments day by day, it's quite scary. I think looking at what's happening in America, especially with Black Lives Matter, the response, the rise of the white supremacists, Donald Trump and his attacks on the postal service, all of these things are really challenging the liberal centre. I think the left has had some gains and some strengths with Sanders and Corbyn, but I think the liberal centre is still posing the most resistance. So as you can see, Bannon was arrested recently, and that was like the liberal state responding. The left need to find a better way to organise, but clearly this capitulation to nationalism is one of the big barriers to the left being an effective resistance. I'm not going to go into detail about every single country and the process of creeping fascism. I think factually that's something that most people here are probably aware of, and if you want to read the book you might find some more details, but there are some global patterns. There's a systemic global conjecture for the rise of the far right. It's the global economy, neoliberalism, the financial crash. It's been well documented and well researched that country by country there's rising wealth inequality, the middle class is being very, very squeezed, and a lot of the support for the far right is actually coming from that squeezed middle class, that sort of blaming up and coming ethnic minorities and positive discrimination for the fact that their children can't get jobs and things like that, when obviously it is actually this like neoliberal trickle up effect rather than trickle down effect. And this is happening across the globe. So, you know, we document in the book the way that far-right parties have been gaining electoral support since the 1980s. And in Europe, this predates the migrant crisis. So this whole idea that it's like huge swathes of refugees and migrants that are causing the rise of the far right is actually, the narrative of the right that's being transposed onto the fact that it's actually neoliberalism and austerity led to the fillip of the far right. Underlying problem, of course, is the capitalist system. I do want to talk specifically about India, and so India has had decades of centrist Congress rule after the independence movement, and Congress wasn't based on the Hindu ethnic nationality. It was trying to promote a more secular, unified Hindu-Muslim identity for India, as well as social democratic citizenship. But in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a lot of corruption, and India started liberalizing under Indira Gandhi, opening up to global corporations. Prior to that, it had been quite protectionist, and with that opening up of the economy, you saw the rise of far-right parties, including the BJP, and they started making electoral gains, and Congress sort of broke its hold on the electoral system, culminating in 2016, or earlier, with Narendra Modi coming to power. Now, Narendra Modi used to work for the RSS, which is a fascist paramilitary organisation in India, and the BJP is political wing. So this isn't just creeping fascism in India, this is actual fascism. And I think that the historic legacy of the British Empire is really key here, actually, because the ideology of nationalism and the partition of India with Kashmir, with Pakistan, East Pakistan, West Pakistan, that fueling of nationalism was like a very concrete project of Churchill's. So one of the things that he was actively supporting was the promotion of Hindu-Muslim communal rivalry and propaganda in Bengal, in Pakistan, and across India, because it was part of the whole divide and rule project. So coming towards the area that I think we need some dialogue and debate on, I think we need to start rethinking the issue of nationalism and imperialism, especially when it comes to the historical legacy of the independence movements in the mid-20th century. And this is something I need to be very careful about, because obviously in the abstract it's quite easy to discuss, but when you come to specific situations, specific geographical areas, it does become more complex. But the real question is, when it comes to nationalist independence movements in the colonized world, they obviously had a very important role to play in the formal political breakup of the Western empires. But what I really want to ask is whether the legacy of those independent nationalisms has actually been that effective, and who really benefits from them. If you look at the Middle East and the way it's broken up into different nation states, and how many of this sort of balkanization almost of the Middle East was promoted by the British Empire, and how, if you look at the Saudi monarchy and some of the Gulf monarchies, these archaic political formations were supported by and are a legacy of the British Empire. And what we have now are less formal imperial structures, economic imperial structures in the Middle East, and you could even say the same applies to India in terms of Bangladesh, Pakistan. That whole broken up situation doesn't really benefit the interests of Bangladesh and Pakistan, especially. Bangladesh has found it very difficult to set itself individually onto its feet economically. India is the powerhouse of the subcontinent, and so the way partition occurred basically hamstrung Pakistan and Bangladesh, and it's created this tension throughout the entire 70 years after independence between Kashmir and India as well. So all these ethnic nationalisms that have been left over after the period of empire, you have these highly militarized borders, you have these ethnic military conflicts constantly breaking out, and the left, whilst showing solidarity with independent nationalist movements from their political oppressors, that's fair, that's fine, needs to move forward and push a more internationalist class-based structure and organization. And I think that does come from rethinking the political categories, because we accept the nation state as a political category. The argument people say is, oh, nation states are real, you can't open the borders because you'll get flooded with migrants, or it just wouldn't work. And even people who are sympathetic ideologically just can't see the practical reality working out. And I can understand why that would be, because no one's really just come up with a very well explained theoretical proposition for an alternative. And yeah, they might exist in books, and intellectual thinkers, I'm sure, have theorized this, but this has not become a part of mainstream discourse on the left, and it hasn't become popularized. And I think this theory is important. It's like the grounding for which our political work can sort of spring from. So practically, of course, we do need to campaign, build a resistance movement towards the rise of racism, migrant solidarity campaigns. We need to do those things, but the rhetoric and the theory that underpins our campaigning should posit an alternative towards just a benign nation state that allows migrants to come in or feel solidarity with other areas. We need a positive imagination of a different structure. Something I just want to put out to the audience, and how do we start building this theoretically? And in terms of the European Union as an internationalist organization, of course there's a struggle for the European Union between the left and the liberals about what the European Union means. So it's not a hard and fast thing, but if you look at the record of the European Union, it is extremely regressive when it comes to the migrant crisis and policing its own borders. The EU has attempted to stop attempts for the African Union and other liberal cross-border organizations. So we really need to think about that. Yeah, so I just want to throw out this question: do we need to accept the abstract idea of the imagined community of the nation state? Internationalism is essential to defeating the climate crisis and nationalism, and what kind of new organizing units and identification categories can we use to describe ourselves and think about, and how do we start popularizing and mainstreaming a more internationalist conception of ourselves, away from the liberal conceptions of European or citizen of the world, which have been thrown out there without any political underlying meaning or structure? How do we put that concrete political structure behind these new identities? And how do we deconstruct the concept of Britain or England and create a change in the consciousness of the movement?